All right, so let's get into grief, because grief is an important thing for us as preppers to consider, because in my opinion, it's an ironclad fact that preparedness involves more than just the superficial tasks of physical preparation, right? It involves more than just going out and getting things and even learning skills. That's all part of it, but it's more than that. Because it's also an ironclad fact that prepping must include the mental and emotional preparations for one of the most debilitating aspects of disastrous times. It's something that's going to happen during this disaster. We're all possibly, likely, depending on the size of the disaster, going to experience grief, right? And grief is important to understand because all of us will most likely struggle with the impact of grief at one or more points during our life. It's part of being human. And I'd argue that as a potential for more significant disaster increases, right? So too does our potential to experience an increase in grief. It only makes sense, right? As the consequence, as the size of a disaster, the intensity of the disaster, the consequence of that disaster, and consequence meaning the impact it has on us, as that goes up, as the consequence of a disaster goes up, the likelihood that we're going to experience grief as a result may also go up. And we're going to talk about all the different types of grief there are and how to know what's going on with grief, right? Because it only goes to reason that if you're truly preparing to face adversity, to face disaster, you should, therefore, as part of your preparedness, learn to recognize and deal with grief in yourself and others, right? Most of us, some of us have people in our lives that are just as into preparedness as we are. And I'd say most, at least a lot of us, we're it when it comes to our preparedness. Therefore, everybody relies on us, right? Everybody relies on you if you're the only one in your household into preparedness. And even if there's a few of you into preparedness, there are other people in your life who will rely on you. Therefore, it's up to us to understand what are these emotional roller coasters people are going to be going through, right? We can talk about the bug out bags, the beans, the bullets, and all that good stuff. But this, the mindset, the emotional reaction in the moment, this is what's going to make you or break you on that day, right? Getting prepared. Preparedness is everything up until the point that you need to take action. And then if you are ready for the action with whatever's coming down the road, that's a great thing. But if something comes down the road that causes people to be emotionally out of whack to where they're not being the most effective decision makers for you, for your family, in your situation, that maybe they're taking things from bad to worse. That emotional side of it, we need to plan on, prepare for, because once the disaster happens, that's the time where all this stuff, we have to understand this. So, because emotions are going to happen. Grief's going to happen. But there's things we can do to work our way through it. There's things we can do to help us understand what we're going through so that the impact of it is not as bad. And I think that's important for preppers, right? Because as preppers, it gives us an advantage. If we know what we're going to deal with psychologically, emotionally, and all that going into a disaster, we're that much better prepared for when it hits. To say, oh yeah, I planned for this. I planned that I'm going to be in this emotional state, this sympathetic nervous system state, this central nervous system state. I've planned on it. I'm doing X, Y, and Z right now. And that doesn't really, I don't know that I should be doing this. Why am I doing this? Oh, I'm in an emotional state. So by understanding how the mindset works, understanding how our emotions work, we can get better prepared to deal with the problems at hand when it happens. And hey, as we talked about, right, you're going to experience grief as we go through life, right? So we know that's going to happen. So by understanding this stuff now, not only does it help us in times of disaster, but it helps us just through our daily lives, and it can help us help others through their daily lives as well. Now, why is understanding grief important for preparedness? Well, unfortunately, as preppers, we often focus exclusively, right, on the physical preparedness, such as stockpiling supplies, creating emergency plans, and developing survival skills, right? That's that one part that comes in as ability in the capability formula, right? The other side of that is mindset, right? And under mindset, that's where your emotional preparedness happens, right? And therefore, mindset and emotional preparedness are just as important as physical preparedness, if not more so. Because if you stockpile a bunch of stuff, you go through all the training, get all the skills, and then in the moment you melt down because your mindset and emotional preparedness are off, what was all that preparedness about that you were doing? It's like, gone up in smoke, right? So after all, we are less likely to put our physical preps, again, to effective use during times of high consequences if we are a mental and emotional wreck. Again, we spend all that time. We need to do the other things that make sure that we're as effective as possible in implementing it. And as a prepper, right, not being effective with your preps in the moment, when time is down, when action needs to happen, that's the last thing I want, and I'm sure it's the last thing that you want. Right? I doubt any of you want that. So knowing what to expect with grief can help people recognize their emotional involvement, right? Emotional involvement in the situation. In other words, hey, I'm not acting rashly. I am emotionally involved. Again, it's the human condition. It's what we do, right? But by knowing what to expect with grief, that can help us recognize our emotional involvement and develop mechanisms to deal with our grief. It helps us deal with other people's griefs, right? And in that vein, it can help us recognize when others are struggling with their grief. And as a result, be as supportive as possible as they work through their grieving process, because it's a process. We're going to get into the 5 steps here in a minute, the 5 stages of grief. It's going to happen when something bad happens and we grieve. There's a thing that we go through. It's the human nature, and trying to push somebody, hey, get through your grieving phases faster is not the way it works, right? So what is grief? Grief is a part of the human condition as a natural response to traumatic events such as loss. Because grief is a part of the human condition, we are all of us, me, you people listening, the people not listening, the people driving in the car right next to you as you're driving down the highway maybe right now, or whatever you got going. All those other people, they are all subject to its effects as well. Because again, it's part of the human condition. We can't get around it, right? If you got around ever having to grieve, you might be some really crazy level of psychopath. Now, some of the effects of grief manifest themselves as sadness, anger, guilt, and confusion. Additionally, the effects can also include physical symptoms like fatigue, insomnia, and loss of appetite. Imagine that. You're tired and you can't sleep and you really don't feel like eating. Yeah, we get that from grief, right? The intensity and duration of grief, right, can vary widely among individuals, and it can last for weeks, months, or even years. At the end of this, I'm going to tell you what I'm grieving right now. It's one of the reasons I've been a little lax in the last couple of weeks on the show. We're going to talk about it. I took a deep dive into grief. Right? I'm in the process of grieving, and I took a deep dive into it because I said, hey, this is something I can experience. What's going on here? And so that's where a lot of this is coming from, my personal experience and me trying to figure out, why am I feeling the way I'm good? What's next on this roller coaster of emotion? So while grief is a challenging, awful, painful experience, right? We know that it is an essential and completely normal part of the healing process, the normal part of dealing with loss, of dealing with bad stuff that happens in our lives. Grief cannot be avoided. However, by acknowledging and understanding it and our emotions, we can gradually come to terms with our grief, finding meaning in our experiences, and ultimately moving forward in our lives. And this is important for preparedness, right? There's some secret strengths we can get out of understanding the grieving process that gives us the leg up on our preparedness. Don't have to spend any money for it in these difficult times. Just have to think about it. It's all we got to do. Burn brain matter up here, right? That's all we have to do on some of this stuff. That's the best thing about preparedness. Yeah, we focus on what can I buy, but it doesn't necessarily always have to be about what you can buy. How can you think, right? Preparedness, you are a prepper. You're playing 3D chess, trying to figure out the future, figuring out the angles, what can go wrong, what's beneficial, what can help me out. So again, this is a mindset thing. This is important, and it doesn't cost anything. It just costs us our attention and the desire to improve ourselves. That's all it is.